bidding rounds. We also have financial instruments, loan and equity funds. We'll come on to that later. The European Social Fund, the larger fund, is worth around £450 million. Most of that money goes to skills and employment programmes, which are match funded by public sector bodies, Education and Skills Funding Agency, Department for Work and Pensions, big lottery fund, and the Her Majesty's Prison and Probation Service. Of that funding, approximately half, and we have some directly funded projects as well, which we'll hear a bit about later, around half that funding has been committed. And that's kind of where we would expect to be, because if this was a normal programme with no Brexit happening, funding's normally committed in kind of 3-year tranches. So one kind of key question for us now is, will these co-financing organisations commit to another 3-year tranche so we can get all the funding out of the door? It's not possible to give the money, or it wouldn't be practicable in London to give all that money out in sort of penny packets. So there's still a couple of £100 million left to commit there.
Okay. With the outcome of the referendum last year, are you anticipating any problems in the co-funding taking place for the next 3 years? So the first 3 years you've just described as being committed. Are you expecting any problems going forward?
Well, it certainly doesn't seem clear at the moment. So again, as you may be aware, the government has said that we can commit funding until the point of Brexit, so the end of March 2019. Whether that means in practice, as 2018 progresses in 2019, that we'll literally be able to sign gigantic contracts the day before we're due to leave remains to be seen, but that's what the government has said. In practice, I think we are seeing some problems now with co-financing organisations. And the Department for Work and Pensions are making attempts, I think, to encourage co-financing organisations to sign up again. And certainly it's the case at the moment. We're in the area where they're saying things like, well, we can extend some of our current programmes a little longer, but it's not clear what the final outcome will be.
Okay. Questions to Lisa and Despina then. What type of European funding does your sector receive from the EU, whether it's ERDF or ESF? And how much is it worth in the current funding period for you? Don't mind which of you jumps in first.
Shall I? So I represent the voluntary community and social enterprise sector in London, and our sector mostly gets the European Social Fund. The European Social Fund invests in education, training and employment support, and it's specifically targeted at those most removed from the labour market. This includes young people, particularly those that are the long-term unemployed, people facing complex barriers to employment, those suffering from long-term physical or mental health conditions, prisoners, prison leavers, ex-offenders. It's difficult to estimate exactly how much of the 422 ESF allocated to London will reach my sector because of the way that it is commissioned out. It's commissioned through a prime contractor model, so where you have a prime contractor who holds a large contract, and then they subcontract the delivery down to other organisations. So I would find it very hard to estimate exactly how much, but it would probably be in the region of getting up for 300 million of the ESF will come down to the sector in some way or another.
Is that your sole source of funding?
No, the sector gets funding from a large variety of places. Local authorities are still one of the biggest funders of the voluntary sector. In London, we are lucky to have some big trusts and foundations that provide a great deal of support to the sector. Larger organisations are involved in public sector contracts and do public sector delivery of various types. And there are also still a lot of individual giving which supports the sector, so it's quite a broad range. But some organisations that take on large ESF commissions do become very dependent on them. It becomes their sort of primary business. So to see the withdrawal of that funding is likely to have quite an effect on a number of organisations. Is
it possible to say within rough proportions how much that makes up as a proportion of overall funding going into the LDSC?
I couldn't do that.
You couldn't?
Sorry, no.
Okay.
It's very difficult to get any kind of estimate about how much funding goes into the sector at all. London Funders, which is the membership body for funders of the sector in London, have been trying to get a figure for it for years, and it's still very, very difficult to actually calculate who's giving what into the sector.
Okay. Same questions to you then, Despina.
Yes, in Enterprise Enfield, we have an allocation this year of this round of £550 50,000 ERDF, which we're matching, and that's to run a women's programme. That's for helping women to start up in business in London and also to grow existing early stage businesses. And it's particularly targeted at disabled women over the age of 50, and also black and ethnic minority women. So it's quite vital for that kind of work. And I think longer term, when we look back into our kind of funding history, it has been quite vital for us. Over the last 9 years, we've been involved with 5 programmes, and not necessarily us as the lead, we worked with other partners as well. There's been a total of 2.7 million ERDF that's been allocated through those programmes, and they've helped us to work with businesses to help with export, environmental management systems, raising finance, and also to find opportunities in the retrofitting market. So they've always addressed market failure. And I think for enterprise agencies, it's quite a vital source of income for working with SMEs, and particularly in the outer boroughs as well. So we're able to work with those kind of smaller SME that it's hard for other organisations to reach.
I asked Alex in the opening question what he expected to happen in the next 3 years, so whether there will be a sudden speeding up of spending what is currently in the pot. Have you noticed any impacts in your sectors since the referendum last year, in terms of assumptions really that your organisations and groups are making?
I think the other enterprise agencies, I'm part of a consortium called Business for London. I think they're all really keen to have this kind of funding. Obviously, they're used to having ERDF for the work that they do. I think we are hoping that it is going to be replaced, because with Brexit coming, it's the challenges that businesses are going to have to face, and that they're going to have to start some really serious planning and making decisions. But they need information to do that. So I think they are going to continue to need support.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think one of the most important things, and particularly for our sector, which always exists in it, we always find it very difficult to plan, because we are never quite certain where our funding is coming from. And I think one of the problems with the situation we have at the moment is just a lack of clarity about what is going to happen going forward. So it's very, very difficult to plan. And of course, that also has the impact on all the people that our organisation supports. I think that's what we also have to remember, is the effect that losing this funding will have on the communities of London.
Are people making plans assuming anything, so assuming that the government will continue the funding, or assuming that it will be gone?
For finding alternative sources of funding for this work. I think for us with the consortium, I think what we've tried to do is work together more closely and start to find some areas that we feel are working very well, and see if we can start talking to the boroughs about trying to fund projects, because we all have a local reach, so we want to make sure that we can work more closely with local authorities, and if they value the work that we're doing, that they'll fund it. But we are aware that obviously local authority budgets are shrinking. It may be potential with areas like Section 106 if it's appropriate, but it is very difficult. There is very little money, and there are a lot of competing priorities. But there still has to be investment in SMEs. I think that can't be ignored.
Okay, Alex, which mayoral priorities would be most at risk if ESIF funding was withdrawn and not replaced by the government?
Well, quite a lot, I would say. So, if you look at the sort of programmes managed from City Hall relating to skills, employment, enterprise, environment, low carbon schemes, they all receive substantial amounts of EU funding, both for projects managed by the GLA and organisations in the GLA family, like London and Partners, and organisations like Despinas and those represented by LISA. There is, in the part, going back a few years, you had Regional Development Agency funding. When they were abolished, there have been local enterprise partnership funding streams. Some of the work Lord Heseltine did to the last government recommending more funding for those has helped pick up some of that slack. While it's important that European funding, we should maybe say this from the start, from the EU's perspective, European funding is always considered as additional to that provided by governments. So, it's not the job of EU funding to fund hospitals, schools and other things in essential, but for these important additional areas of funding. But I think what you've seen over time in London and perhaps the UK more widely is a bit of an erosion of the sources of match funding for this EU funding, and now the EU funding itself is at risk.
It's highly likely that when we report at the end of the work of this committee, we will be making a recommendation to government that government replaces the funding that would be lost as we leave the European Union. Have you been doing work building that up on behalf of the Mayor's office?
Yes, there's a lot of work going on this, and if you've been keeping an eye on, the Mayor's sort of press notices and so on, you will see repeated calls for devolved replacement domestic funding of at least the value of the current EU programmes and at least a level of devolution of current EU programmes. I think there was a meeting last week of the Mayor and Council leaders, the Congress, and one of the outcomes of that is that the Mayor and London Councils will be writing jointly to the government with a paper setting out our views on how that future funding could look, and there's an advanced draft of that knocking around now. So I think this is going to be an increasing, it has been an increasing focus of attention sort of on the 8th floor here, and I think that's going to continue.
Yeah, we're going to be seeing the Mayor tomorrow, so we'll do a bit of a deeper dive with him, I think, at that time. Yeah. Okay, I'm done, Chairman.
Thank you very much. Can I welcome Lord Esseltine? I understand you've been experiencing I wouldn't say the joys of London traffic, but in terms of getting to City Hall. And we fully understand that. I've got a set of questions. I just want to say, partly because even though we're in different political parties, you are one of the few national politicians that's influenced my thinking and practice, my actions, in some of the work that you've done over the many years when you were in public office of National Parliament. And I just want to say thank you for that, because I don't normally get an opportunity to say that to you, and I want to say that because some of the work that you did around, not just grant regimes, partnership working, issues around how councillors behave and leadership at local and regional level has impacted on a whole host of my colleagues and peers. So I want to place that on record, and that's why we've got you before us, because the experience that you've had in some of those programmes, in some of those issues around delivery mechanisms and thinking about regionalism and localism, of why we think at this important time, not just for the country, but for us in London, thinking what happens if we leave Europe and what happens to these sources of funding. So my questions, in terms of questions, really concentrate on around the national picture, what it means in terms of the relationship to London. But please feel free to comment on other questions as well in terms of your views. So regional development, if we start from that point, has a long and varied history in the UK, and many of the programmes now do depend on European funding, apart from the growth fund of the LEAP which you've commented on. In your view, how have the European structural investment funds really benefited the UK and London? What's your perspective on that?
Well, thank you for your generous remarks. You will perhaps understand if I urge you to keep quiet. You don't do me a lot of good in the Conservative Party.
It won't do me much good in my party either.
Yeah, I agree. We've probably got a mutual self-interest of destruction in this context. Well, it's more money. And my understanding of what's actually happened with the European funding is that the Europeans wanted an implementation strategy that was extremely local. That didn't suit Whitehall, and so they parcelled it up amongst the functional departments of Whitehall and used it as another lever to run the domestic economy. I personally don't approve of that. I think that the devolution agenda, which is now moving and in some ways is impressive, is at a very early stage. And my whole approach to Brexit or non-Brexit is not conditional on the devolution issue. We should have done the devolution issue a long time ago, and we should do it now on a much bigger and faster scale. If there's a replacement for the European structural funds, and whether there are big issues about that, whether London needs them, whether they should go more to the more deprived or underperforming parts of the economy, these are big issues which governments will have to determine. My guess is that certainly outside London there will be replacement of the European funding. my whole interest in the subject will be about what specific use is made of the money and by whom. I mean, if I can give you an example of something that I covered in a speech in spring this year. In the 1990s, I created a framework to involve tenants in the management of public sector housing. It made some progress, but not much. I think that today we need to cost the public sector programs that apply to deprived communities and involve those communities in a debate as to whether this is the right use of the money. The money is functionally divided. There are social workers, there are police, there are educationalists, there are experts on this, that, or the other. And they all have their packet of money, but those people who are administering the packet never meet, and there's no one in charge. So there's no coordination, and no one ever talks to the tenants. I believe Westminster have done some interesting work in this field. What I would like is to have a real debate saying, look, this is the money that is flowing into these areas. Is it being used in a way that you, the tenants, think are more likely to improve the conditions? And the language I would use is create ladders of aspiration, because most of the problems are dealt with by sticking plasters. This is a problem, put money into that problem. What is not sufficient is saying, how do you raise the whole morale and ambition and opportunity of people living in these circumstances, which I think would happen with more local involvement and with a more coordinated approach. But that's just one example of why, when we talk about any of these big global funds, my interest immediately goes into what happens when the money is actually spent, by whom, where, and with what results.
Well, thank you for that. If we could, and you mentioned during that you thought definitely is going to be a programme outside London. London receives around 11% of the, I think it's the English share of ERDF and ESIF. You, in other past reports, have talked about that London's prosperity shouldn't be at the expense of the rest of the country, but equally, London shouldn't be held back. So, in terms of a grant regime of the future, what would that look like in terms of the nature of London and the South East, in terms of generating tax dollars, in terms of the UK economy?
Well,
Do you think there is a case where, can you see a case where London shouldn't be part of this grant regime, or it needs a specific grant regime that may be different from the rest of the country?
Well, what is beyond question is that London has some of the most acute areas of deprivation in the country. So there is undoubtedly a need for public sector intervention. The issue is whether London itself is so much more prosperous than the rest of the country that it could afford that without a redistribution mechanism of national resources, or in this case, European resources. That is a very legitimate debate, and I think probably from my knowledge of the circumstances outside London, there is an argument saying that London should be able to finance its own social remedial programs. But this is a highly controversial political judgment which will depend on calculations about marginal seats and goodness knows what.
Very much so. And also the opinion formers that live in London in many ways, isn't it? Because that affects outcomes and programmes of government as well. Would you say that?
Well, I think it's true, but I'm not sure that it's quite the logical explanation. I may not be using the right words. You have to look at these functional departments, and you have to think about the careers and the interests and the commitments and the genuine attention to do well of the people who are ministerially responsible, who work as officials in those departments or serve in the quangos surrounding them. And they want to do the best they can within the function that they operate. What they don't like is any suggestion that their functional budget should be shared with or watered down for outside functional departments. There is not a culture of cooperation. There is not a culture of cross-fertilization or analysis wider than the function. And you're perfectly right. By and large, the people who make these decisions are in London. But I'm not sure that being in London is the condition that makes them think the way they do. I think it's the human nature of the individuals. But quite rightly, they want to do well. Their career depends on doing well. They want to serve properly. So the fact they're in London is sort of almost incidental.
Okay. In 2012, in the publications No Stone Unturned, you put a lot of faith in local enterprise partnerships. There's been an NAO report that you no doubt be aware of about issues around capacity of those partnerships, and we've seen a response from government of giving some extra funding or creating the growth fund around that. What's your view about the effectiveness? So it's LEPs outside in London. We might talk about LEAP inside London. That's what we refer to, but it's the same mechanism. What do you think about their effectiveness, and where do you see their development going in the future, and particularly what needs to change if we were to leave, if we were to leave or are to leave the European Union in terms of their work?
Well, my view is that Brexit is irrelevant to the opportunity for the LEPs. We should have had something like this yonks ago, and I did try creating the business links.
Yes.
But like so much in this country, there is a sort of party political process which looks at what a government is doing, and if it hears criticism, reduces or abolishes the particular the criticised body. My slight problem in this is that I've created so many of these things, which my party has then gone on to destroy. But you see, the regional process, I was involved very significantly in creating the regional offices of government in the 90s. And the regional offices of government were not rocket science. Several of the major government departments had their regional offices largely in Manchester, Bristol, wherever it was, the sort of places you would expect them to be. But they all sat in different offices doing their transport or doing their what, or their home office or whatever it was. And they never met. And these were the outposts of central government. They were the listening posts. They were the one-stop shop. They were not the one-stop shop. They were the shop where you could go locally without having to get on a train to London. And so I created a very simple little process of saying, look, I think we'll put you all in one building, and we will choose a civil servant from one of those outposts to be the chairman. And at the time, I deliberately made sure the chairperson came from different government departments, because I didn't want it to be seen as a sort of land grab for my power ambitions. So they came from different departments to spread it round. Now that was so innocuous and sensible as a management innovation that it's hardly difficult to make it credible. But of course we then had a change of government, and onto this process was added layers of political activity, leading in the end to the referenda for regional devolution. So my party got very agitated by that. And the first thing they did when they came back in, I think, 2010, was to abolish the whole lot. What I could have told them is that, of course, is not the way the civil servants work. That instead of, if you like, sacking all the people involved, which was getting rid of the whole apparatus, which is the implication of the policy. What happened is that the civil servants simply took offices, just like they'd had before. And so having moved all into one building, they all moved out of the building back into these disparate offices. But in order to make this a sort of policy that made some sort of sense and could be defended, they created the local enterprise partnerships. And I remember because I was working for the government at the time, I knew these local enterprise partnerships very well. And they would say to me, look, it's fantastic, it's so cheap here, there's just me and the secretary. And so I felt really that was not quite adequate for the task, but it was a sort of psychological gesture of, they're costing nothing, they're not doing any harm, so let them alone. So systematically I was able to help the first ministers find some money to start rebuilding the business links. But the really interesting thing about the local enterprise partnerships is that it sounds incredible now, but I was part of the Conservative front bench that had to deal with the Redcliffe-Maud report of 1969. And there were 1,400 authorities in this country in 1969. And Redcliffe-Maud came up with a Martian view, saying there should be 61. And the joke of politics and the LEPs is if you look at the Redcliffe-Maud report and there's 61 authorities, which made economic sense, and then you put alongside it the map of the local enterprise partnerships, guess what? They're virtually the same. So any sort of intellectual neutral analysis of the way this country should operate actually comes up with about 60 authorities. And for me, they would be democratically governed, and there would be a mayor, just like everywhere else in the world. So anyway, but over the last few years, we've managed to get more and more money into the local enterprise partnerships, and so far, it has been an incremental process and much to be admired. It hasn't yet started producing the sort of anti-movement which could lead to challenging it. But the way that where it starts invariably is that there'll be some LEPs which are not so good. So the opposition party will pick up the grumbles and say, no, these things aren't working. Next step, policy formulation, we've got to have something new to say, get rid of them. Whereas the solution is not that at all. The right solution, the simple solution, is to say, if they're not working, who's in charge? Change the person in charge. Get better people. And at the same time, make the job more worthwhile by devolving more powers. Let me give you the most classic example. The skills agenda. The skills agenda is run by the Department of Education. And so why not actually devolve the colleges of further education to the LEPs? Because the LEPs are a partnership between the third sector, involving the third sector itself, but including academia, because the vice chancellors are there, the private sector, because they share with the public sector, the three partners, the one certainty that all those three will actually employ the local people, kids now in the schools. That's where the jobs are coming from. So they know what sort of demands they want, what sort of standards they should have, and they should be deeply involved in training the skills, the kids or the young people for the jobs that will be available, not some government department. So that's a classic example. But if you do that, you're able to say to local industrialists, look, we know you're running a major international company and it's a hell of a strain, but it is worth your while to become involved in this devolved process because you're going to get the best people out of that process. And the truth is, all over the country, there are first-class companies today that are doing just this. Our problem is not trying to create excellence in this country. It's trying to spread excellence deeper down the chain.
And so, in moving on to new regimes then, and meeting the new challenges that we face, whether it's Brexit or just the continuing challenge in terms of economic growth and development, spreading it, making sure it goes deeper in terms of the different sectors, So you alluded to earlier on about the single pot. The real challenge is get these existing budgets that are already there, and are they being used rightly and appropriately? I think you're telling us that the LEP is probably the delivery vehicle that needs to be built on. What other nudges do we need in terms of some of the work that you've done in the past around what those future grant regimes would do? Is there, you know, in terms of, like, you talked about skills. I think I get the skills bit. I understand that. And we've done some work around that, scrutiny work around development of skills here in the London Assembly. So I understand that. What other nudges would you like to see?
Well, forgive me for being frank, but if you asked me the question, if I was in your position, I would choose the 3, 4, 5 most effective competitor economies, and I would send study groups to each of them with the remit to come back and say what support systems exist for the companies that operate in France, Germany, Singapore, Korea, Japan, and America. And I would then look and ask myself, do we need to replicate any of this here? And I think, frankly, you would be appalled by the report you got back. I'm actually this afternoon finishing a report on this for my own purposes that I'm going to publish. And I've included some of the researching that I've done into the sort of questions I've suggested, but you're so much bigger and more important than me. But you will find that all the other capitalist economies are way out ahead in terms of the research, in terms of the support that they give their companies. I mean, one fact, London Chamber of Commerce, 20,000 members. Paris Chamber of Commerce, 300,000 members. You know, and multiply that all over the place.
Right. And just in terms of your experience of establishing grant regimes, say City Challenge, single regeneration budget, in terms of the commissioning of that, how long did it, take any of your regimes that you were involved in, how long did it take you from concept to actually practical implementation?
Days.
Sorry?
Days.
Days?
Days. It started in Liverpool in 1979. Peter Shaw, who was the Labour Secretary of State for the Environment before me, had done an interesting innovation. He had created partnerships with some of the more deprived cities, with deprived communities, in order to involve his ministerial team directly, and he himself had taken a responsibility for Liverpool. He was the chairman of the partnership. The second piece of information, so I was asked if I wanted to continue that. I said, fine. The second piece of information I already had is one of the most effective ministerial colleagues I ever worked for was Peter Walker, and he had created in the 70s a grant mechanism to get rid of the coal tips and the soil tips and all the detritus of yesterday's manufacturing and processes, and he had grant mechanisms. So in 79, I was faced with two questions. Did I want to continue the partnership? And what was I going to do with this grant mechanism? And I thought, I do want to keep the grant mechanism, and I do want the mechanism, the partnership. But I'm going to move the grant mechanism into cities, because Peter's job had more or less been done. The green fields had been restored. So I had this, I've forgotten what it's called now, what grant mechanism. And one of my first meetings, long before the riots in Liverpool, I said, look, I'm going to have this grant mechanism, and it's going to be available to clear derelict land in the cities. And Liverpool was not short of derelict land. And I said, there's only two changes I'm going to make. And the first is that I'm going to look for contributions from the private sector in partnership. So if I have £1, I want to know what you will contribute, private sector, for my pound. And secondly, I'm going to do it in competition, so that this will not be an entitlement. One of the problems of the public sector is entitlement. People say there are 10 of us, we've got certain problems, therefore we're entitled to a tenth of the 100 in the country. That's a very logical and human approach, but it's the wrong approach. The way to get standards up is to actually say that, yes, you have a problem, show us what you will add and show us the results you will achieve, and then distinguish between those who do better and those who don't. So that took no time at all. It was just an instinctive way that it could get better results. And it worked significantly. I mean, the obvious thing is, look, here's an acre of derelict land. I will take the negative value out of it. Well, it was 6,000 acres of derelict land just over there. I'll take the negative value out of it. You've got to build houses. And we were building 2,000 houses a year within a year and a half or something of that sort in East London. So that led on to City Challenge, where I was in 1990. I proved to my satisfaction that derelict land you could deal with. By then, the development corporations were achieving remarkable results and big gearing. Over here, 10 private pounds for every 1 public pound. Even Liverpool, at the bottom of the market, £1.50 of private money for every £1. So it worked. But then I faced deprived communities, and that, of course, is a wholly new ballpark because you're dealing with people. And so I took a chance, and I said to 30 authorities, I'm afraid they were virtually all Labour authorities, you've got some very deprived communities, I've got some money, you bid me for, I had 10 packages of 35 million, that was 7 million a year spread over 5 years. I've got 10 packages, there are 30 of you, you come up and show me what you'll do, how you'll do it, who will run it, but only 10 of you are going to win. And of course there was an outcry, because this was deprivation, and this was competition, and this was terrible capitalist economy thinking. But I laid down 1 or 2 conditions, not just there had to be discrete management, a team of people who worked together under one leader to deal with this, but they had to talk to the tenants, the local community, and they had to get buy-in. Well, the result was, of course, the 10 did win. There were some who made some quite unpleasant noises about the process, but the next year it was transformational. All the 20 zoomed in on the 10, and the standards rose unbelievable. And I'll give you one example. I was very fond of a guy called Dick Knowles. You probably met him. He was the Labour leader of Birmingham. Yep. And when coming to the determination of these packages, my ministerial team and I did it. And I did the Birmingham one. And I knew Dick quite well. We got on well. And in his bid to win, I asked the questions, and I said, well, Dick, that's very interesting. What are the head teachers in this area think about the process? He said, oh, well, we'll tell them. And that's the moment when he lost, because he'd never asked them. Actually, he then said some quite uncomfortable things, but the Wolverhampton press, who won, came from, again, another Labour authority, came to my defence, saying, no, he lost because he didn't do a good enough job, which I think I've treasured the press release.
Okay, and then finally for me, and I'll bring some other colleagues in, so do you have so I think you've painted a picture about the LEP, you've given us some ideas about what a grant regime should, some of the features we should be looking for in terms of if government creates one. In terms of capacity, and I really want to pressure on the capacity of LEAPs or structures here in London. So have you got any comment on the current structure of local regional government in London around delivery of the future challenges this country faces or London faces in terms of those grant regimes?
I think you've got too many London boroughs. And it's so easy for me to say that because I don't have to do anything about it, but doing anything about it it would be stretching. But because I had the marvellous privilege of looking at the East End corridor, and we would by now have produced a report if events had not gone the way they did. And here is a fantastic opportunity for your authority. You can't do it on your own, but you are an essential part of it. And picking up the pieces that were very close to being finalised when I left is something that is absolutely vital, regardless of Brexit. I mean, the one thing for sure is that wedge there is going to develop significantly over the next 10, 20, 30 years. There is no way you can stop it. Certainly shouldn't want to. But there are huge questions about how. And basically, they come down to a very, very simple question. Do you want the gradualism field by field? Because that's the easy way for the politicians. Don't rock any boats, just take the housing field by field. But if you really want to do something that you can be proud of and your children will be proud of, because you won't all live to see the completion of it, I certainly won't, then you've got to have a much more imaginative view. And the report that we would have produced by now would have taken the high road, the imaginative route, which would not have been about urban sprawl and one more line of identikit housing. You've got to create communities, places where people want to live, places where people can get and are happy to be there and broadly represent exciting, stimulating communities. You've got to build on local strengths and opportunities. It's not rocket science. It is just politically difficult. And at the present situation, the administrative arrangements are quite inadequate. Quite inadequate. When you get there, you see you've got the GLA, you've got the boroughs, you've got 2 counties, you've got dozens of districts, and you've got quangos, all sorts of quangos. Quangos are a very interesting part of this mix because they, well, I better not get going on quangos.
Sean Berry.
I wanted to ask a little bit more about LEPs. A lot of the money outside of London that's going to LEPs is transport money, but that's a contrast to the LEAP in London, which has a higher proportion of its money coming from the European funds, skills, that sort of thing. Do you have a comment on, is there a difference between the LEAP in London and LEPs across the rest of the country? Is it a better LEP in that it's more focused? Is it better because it works alongside a devolved government that does other things?
I have no experience of how good or not good the London arrangements are. I mean, it's interesting that is my case, except for the East End Commission. My work was broadly in trying to achieve devolution outside London, and I had very little to do with the London arrangements.
Caroline.
You've talked a little bit about City Challenge, and then you had single regeneration budget, SRB programme after that, and then when Labour came in, they brought in New Deal for Communities. Do you have any commentary if there's anything out of that that could be looked at for going forward with the new funds that we may have to replace European funding?
Well, I do. There was absolutely no case for not pursuing City Challenge. I mean, it's a classic example that new people need new labels on the doors, and the City Challenge was a model of its sort. Look, you would expect me to say that, but all sorts of people who have said that to me, not from my party, but from the Labour Party largely, have told me it's one of the best things that ever happened. And so bring it back. And the machinery is there, the machinery to devolve power to local tenants is there. It doesn't work particularly effectively, and it hasn't spread anything like as widely as it should, but it's there, the machinery. And, well, again, I was doing 2 things. David Cameron asked me to joint chair of his 100 deprived estates, and that again I'm no longer doing. And I was very interested in that, and all the things I've said to you were built into the approach that we were taking, but there were two additional things that we were doing which I found very interesting, and I've hinted at them earlier. The first was to do a costing of what these deprived communities are costing. Now, no one should be against that. You know, of course, people say, oh, well, he's only looking at the cost because he wants to cut them. That's not the case at all. What I want to know is what is the cost of sustaining deprived communities? And I want to know it because I want to find out if the money is being effectively spent. And could it be spent more effectively? And so that immediately links you to the second thing that I was doing beyond this investigation. And I think Westminster has done some work on this. But the second thing is, when I got the costing, which we were quite well advanced in getting it, because some earlier work had been done, then I would have wanted, we'd already chosen the estates, I think. We were going to go to the tenants and say, now look, this is what is coming into this estate every year from these sources. What do you think? I mean, I made a speech in the unusual background of the Chelsea Flower Show this year, which was all about horticulture as part of urban renewal. And the first reaction is, he's gone off with the fairies. But actually, if you start thinking about some of the most acute problems of urban deprivation is mental stress. So do you treat them as people with a mental problem? No. Why not find out why they've got stress? And you find out they haven't got a job, no prospect of a job. You find out that they don't know how to pay their rent at the end of the week. And so all these stresses, as they sit doing nothing, because they have no job, add up to a mental condition, which is a very understandable thing. Supposing you could find ways of infusing them into some local activity, and then you start thinking about urban horticulture as part of the process of rebuilding communities. And then you start thinking about city farms and the remarkable effect they've had on young kids who've never experienced that sort of relationship. And you build all this into a pattern of inter-community relationship. If somebody was responsible for helping Mrs. Jones, who's 82, look after her garden, which is not a very skilled job, if they do it well, a mile away there is Mrs. Williams, who is 82 and can afford a gardener, but can't get one. So you start getting into all of this, and you can think of endless permutations on what I've said, but only will you get there by getting to the local people, sitting them in a room and say, look, how can we do this better? That was the theme, and it all is part of the same thing. If you really want to make devolution work, you've got to get down to a level where it can have an impact, and you've got to talk to the people who are involved and who are doing it and the front line in it, not people sitting on committees 200 or 300 miles away.
Thank you.
Sean, should we move to your question?
Yes, sure. Question 3, however. Yes, I wanted to ask about the Shared Prosperity Fund. So, Chris from BEIS. How do we pronounce that?
BEIS.
BEIS. Thank you. So, Chris from BEIS, we wanted to ask you about the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. This is the proposed fund that might replace some of the European funds. So, can we ask you, first of all, from a London perspective, obviously we're all concerned whether London will get the funds replaced that we currently receive. Is the government committed to doing that?
So obviously I should start by saying that I can't kind of speak on behalf of ministers. I can only kind of talk about kind of where we've got to so far in the process. And you will appreciate that the challenges of negotiating the UK's exit from the EU are large and current and consistently moving. And so kind of our ability to kind of design a new programme sort of partly relates on the extent to which we kind of negotiate our exit from the EU. So we should kind of bear that in mind in what I'm about to say. So firstly, I think we can say that the government has committed to use European structural funds money that comes back to the UK after the departure from the EU to create a United Kingdom Shared Prosperity Fund. We sort of made that commitment. That was a commitment both in the manifesto and has since been made by the government. The aim for this future fund will be looking at kind of some of the kind of major challenges that we face in this country, including on productivity and reducing economic inequalities across all 4 nations of the Union. The new fund, as it's developed, will present a fresh opportunity to think about how we can redesign and potentially extract some of the complexities that were in the existing funds into a model that works for the UK and for the places in the UK that will kind of essentially be implementing these funds, rather than those set by kind of the EU priorities that have been both agreed by the UK government but also the EU. So an important kind of point, and that the manifesto is kind of clear that this is the kind of direction of travel and that we will commit to consulting and discussing our kind of plans as they develop with places both across the kind of devolved administrations but also kind of city regions, local authorities and LEPs as part of that kind of wider consultation, which we plan will be kind of set forward in the future once our kind of plans are a bit firmer.
Okay, and have you settled on you've mentioned productivity, you've mentioned reducing inequalities across the 4 nations. Have you settled on measures of how you'll distribute the funds? And we've proposed as an assembly, for example, using indexes of deprivation, inequality measures, as opposed to overall prosperity of the region, because obviously London does have that. Are you setting those parameters up at the moment?
So I think there's kind of a few things that we need to think about in the context of this. There's partly the kind of parameters of the fund and its scope, etc. There's the kind of design and the kind of detailed implementation. All of these are sort of like valid points that we need to kind of think about and kind of work up. I think we haven't set a particular position as of yet. I think, if you look at the past programmes that this government and the previous coalition government have developed, there are lots of different mechanisms of kind of distributing funds, some which has time to be aware of around competitive processes, some are around kind of distribution models based on kind of equity and indices of deprivation. There are lots of different kind of models that we can look at, and I think all of those kind of options will be on the table, and I think it's up to kind of officials, ministers and places to decide on which ones are the most appropriate to kind of deliver the sorts of outcomes that we want around increasing productivity and reducing those economic inequalities.
Are you talking to the GLA? Are you talking to the LEPs about their record to date of distributing funds, and how are you asking them for reports?
So we speak to so part of my day job is to kind of speak to, I think I cover 11 LEPs across the country, including London. And so we speak quite regularly with kind of colleagues in LEPs and in local areas about the kind of the types of interventions that work, the things that really deliver for kind of local communities and to drive local growth. So we're in regular kind of contact and consultation about what works and what doesn't. I think in direct kind of regards to where we get to on the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, we've yet to launch our consultation. So whilst we will be open to discussing kind of where we get to on that, we haven't embarked on a kind of whole host of kind of open sort of dialogue with places. However, that doesn't mean that places couldn't approach us with some of their ideas for what they think a kind of future prosperity fund should look like and what the best and most appropriate mechanisms are for distributing that fund, including the types of outcomes that it seeks to kind of deliver. So we are open to a conversation, and I think in conversations that the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government has had with the Mayor, as well as the other ministers across kind of Whitehall, they are keen to both encourage the Mayor and the GLA and London councils to write to us on the types of plans that they think need to be delivered to make this kind of programme work in London. And as I say, we've yet to make any kind of direct decisions on how this fund is kind of operated or what it constitutes, but we need to have those conversations and we're open to a dialogue.
Okay, what's the urgency for you? So you say people need to write to you. Your consultation will put forward proposals, or will your consultation be quite open-ended at that point, and when will it be launched?
Yeah, so I think we would need to kind of factor in, so it's obviously quite a complex sort of arrangement. So obviously there are European funds that exist. There are also potentially other funds that could be in scope that ought to be thought about as well. And there's obviously a kind of quite close link to devolution and the wider types of activity that have been going on in the past over this government's or the past government's kind of approach and this government's future approach to devolution. So there are a range of things that need to be included. The kind of consultation phase that we create will kind of enable us to both take on board comments and design kind of features as well as then implement them in time to be alive from day one of the UK's exit from the EU. And it's that transition that we need to make sure happens effectively. The time it takes will depend on kind of the type of scope that we're looking for. But I think our commitment is to make sure that from day one we have a scheme in place that kind of essentially takes over from the European funds that would have been lost.
Okay, great. Can I just check again though? I mean, when will the consultation come, and how much will it be a proposal, and how much will it be asking for views?
So it'll be a combination of kind of some ideas on where we might go, plus some kind of views on kind of priorities and structures, etc. The timing is partly dependent on what ministers kind of see as the kind of immediate priorities. So there's a kind of there's an interaction between what we might do at a devolved administration level, as well as then what we do on an English level. So there are kind of elements that we would need to kind of consult on. So ministers have yet to decide the point at which this consultation would be launched, but we've obviously done some kind of work internally to think through what some of the kind of key questions might be, and what we need to kind of what we should be asking kind of places in order to get the right outcomes back, so we can integrate those into the development of the programme.
Okay, you mentioned other funds that might be brought into this. Do you have an idea of those, which of those are in scope that you might give us an indication of?
So we would look at kind of this in the round. So the kind of the transition from a European fund into a kind of domestic fund enables us to think more creatively about the types of objectives that a fund might have, and those funds that might have previously been aligned to the types of activity that this could drive in the future at a local level could be repurposed, or we could design a slightly bigger fund that captures some of those and sort of dissolves some of the previous funds. So it's kind of an open-ended kind of conversation on what are the types of outcomes that we're looking for the fund and what's the best means in order to drive those. And we'd want to not impose too many huge restrictions on the different component parts of a fund, in the same way that the European sort of priorities were developed with multiple drivers, multiple outcomes, multiple different ways of operating. We want to keep it as simple and as effective as possible, driven by those two kind of big objectives around driving productivity and reducing sort of social inequality.
Okay, so generally then this committee, this assembly, we should be writing in as quickly as possible with ideas and including ideas of other funds that could be brought.
Yeah, so I'd encourage you to write in to us on how you think you drive kind of local growth and those kind of those sort of productivity and so reducing social inequality challenges across London, and obviously there will be a formal consultation as well, so where we would also encourage you to kind of respond. But there is no reason why people can't write in today, and certainly we have had sort of representations from organisations willing to kind of sort of drive some of our thinking. So we would encourage places, as we would any LEP who was interested in trying to influence where we go next on these funds. So I would encourage you to do right straight away and also respond to the consultation when it happens. And I think our teams are willing, once the consultation goes live, to come out and do sessions both in London and around the rest of the country to kind of facilitate that dialogue and also get the best possible outcome for kind of places.
Okay. Great. My final question. In general, the government's preferred to devolve more capital spending rather than revenue funding streams. Are they in scope as well? Will the things that are currently funded by the European funds that are revenue funding, they'll continue to be revenue funded? Can we bring in other revenue funds if we're making suggestions?
Yeah, so I think so we need to kind of factor in both kind of revenue and capital kind of expenditure, where we have funds that are driving. So let's use an example, employment outcomes, for instance. Obviously, much of those are revenue related, so we would encourage places to think about those. So it's both the big kind of infrastructure and things that we care about in terms of driving both big and small infrastructure, as well as then the kind of human kind of capital related interventions around people and how they both get jobs or kind of increase their skills, etc., which are kind of similar to the types of schemes that exist already. So it's both capital and revenue related. So it's essentially, think about it in the context of what do you do to kind of make places grow. You invest in people and you invest in those places, and it's the means to do that you need to think about.
Caroline Pidgeon.
Yeah, Chris, I don't think you really answered Sian's question. You said that there are other funds in scope. Can you just give us an example, a name of a fund or several funds that might be the sort of thing you're looking at, just so we can get a clearer picture?
So I think that there are other funds in scope to kind of be thought about in the context of sort of a devolution type conversation, plus what we do post kind of the UK's exit. So if you take Local Growth Fund, for instance, so that's been driving lots of the kind of local investment that the LEP makes in terms of small kind of local growth kind of initiatives. It wouldn't be kind of, given the drive on productivity and reducing inequality, you can certainly see a kind of link between something like that being connected to this type of intervention going forward. So that would be one example, and there'll be others that kind of cut across a range of different things. I guess it partly depends on how we think about place in the context of this.
Sorry, go on.
So I would just assume that this new UK Prosperity Fund is going to at least match what we were getting from these European Union funds. But if you're going to roll in some of those others, could those be included? So actually it's a reduction overall in funds
not necessarily.
Regeneration.
So yes, it will so the commitment that has been made is the commitment that will continue to kind of be met. There's also kind of options, so so I don't want to talk about quantums because I can't, but certainly if you're thinking about the commitment that has been made, that no kind of places will lose out as a result of this transition, and then if we thought about additional funds on top of those to drive the types of outcomes that we're looking for, then certainly I wouldn't just kind of see this as a sort of binary, this is the EU funds and then there's the transition. There might be other funds that come into the table in addition to the types of kind of funds that were there previously. So I wouldn't see this as a kind of single set of discussions.
Okay, I think there's something to potentially watch there.
But the assumption should be, so a working assumption should be that we could, depending on what the situation is, take the existing European funding as a starting working draft, and there could be other funds on top of it. It does beg the question, say on the skills debate, is it just your department or is it government-wide departments involved in developing this fund? And because we have ambitions here in London around the skills agenda, we thought we had a deal. We've nearly had a deal around FE colleges. It didn't quite happen and was changed. And there may be a different appetite in government in terms of post-Brexit. But I agree with Lord Esseltine. It shouldn't really be about Brexit or not. It should be about what do we want to deliver. So who's holding the ring on skills and driving that forward in this part of the grant regime?
Yep.
Your department or another department?
So I should kind of make clear that my department covers, so I cover both two departments, so
yes,
both DCLG and BAYS as part of the Cities and Local Growth Unit. And I think my job here is also in part to kind of help kind of implement the devolution kind of MOU and deals that have been signed between government and London over the past few years. So just specifically on the kind of AEB sort of point so the adult education budget point that you make on skills, so that commitment has been made from 1920, those funds will be devolved. So I do not think that we're not reneging on that deal. That deal has been kind of, it is going to happen. The timing has taken slightly longer than we would have hoped, but that's in place to go forwards. In terms of, so just to kind of make that point. And then secondly, this is a kind of cross-Whitehall sort of kind of operation. There are lots of different sort of departmental interests in all of this. So whether you think about air quality, environment, or whether you think about kind of jobs or growth or infrastructure. So there are lots of different kind of interested parties. Our kind of unit is leading on some of that work across Whitehall, and we are sharing papers with kind of ministers across Whitehall. So it's a kind of a joined up government approach to this, which is not too dissimilar from a lot of the conversations that we've had around devolution, which is why I kind of point to where we're thinking about skills. Obviously, with the devolution of the adult education budget, And there's a kind of question as to how this future fund might link in with some of the kind of outcomes that skills budget that has been devolved and will be operational in 1920 is then delivered. So these things in the past have kind of intersected quite regularly. So if I give a kind of example to make it a bit clearer. So on the adult education budget, some of those funds are used to kind of unlock skills investments through the European Social Fund, for instance. So there are kind of discussions about how do those two things fit together going forward, and you can apply that to DWP funds, you can apply that to other types of initiatives that exist. So it's a kind of cross-government kind of set of approaches with working groups and all of the necessary papers, but we're not yet at a point where we can say definitively, or ministers aren't yet at a point where they can say definitively how the fund will be structured, but we intend to do that, and we intend to do it in plenty of time to enable us to switch this new kind of fund on from day one of us leaving.
And let's just ask, in terms of some of this thinking going on, so let's go back to the issues that Lord Esseltine raised around leadership, capacity and delivery. Because that's what we want, isn't it? So who's delivering? What's the current thinking at this stage around those three issues in terms of any new funds? Now, we've got an NAO report saying actually LEAPs are quite good, but there's a capacity problem in terms of delivery. Is that something on your radar, or is that something at this stage that you think, hold on, these are the structures I'm dealing with now, this is what we need to do? Is there, I'm not asking for ministerial views, but civil servant views. You've been working with these groupings. Okay, we've got new challenges. There's a bit of hindsight, or not hindsight about, or thinking about the future of what those challenges look like and who can deliver.
Yeah, so I think we've been thinking about that for quite a long time, and obviously all of the schemes that we design, we think about the extent to which they're both led, how they're delivered, and the extent to which they deliver outcomes, and so that is something that we've taken into account and will continue to take into account. I think we're still at quite a kind of embryonic phase in terms of setting those kind of top-level priorities, and then what interventions then come beneath those in order kind of to drive those priorities. And so once we have a better understanding of those and we reach agreement across departments on what those should look like, then we'll get into, okay, so at what tier should these be delivered? What are the types of processes and mechanisms we'll use to kind of deliver those, taking into account all of our experience across, sort of multiple kind of years of delivering these types of schemes, looking at past evaluations to make sure that we're designing the thing that works best. And I think one of the areas that we're particularly keen to kind of probe is the extent to which the local works best maxim that kind of lots of kind of places kind of tell us, and what evidence there is that does represent kind of the best value for money in these cases.
I'm a localist, and when local government works in London, and it can be superb, but equally in terms of grant regimes, it's the too small a unit to deliver, and you need to work either in partnership with other boroughs and other sectors in terms of delivery. What's your thinking about that if London was there? Where would that come into it or not?
I mean, it's probably not appropriate for me to say exactly what I think about London and how it delivers.
Well, let's talk generally about what's a viable unit in terms of delivering a grant regime down around on it, because I think I can apply the London issue to other parts of the country in some ways of who might be a suitable delivery mechanism of how it works.
So we haven't made decisions on the most viable delivery units. Obviously, there's a strong emphasis on the importance of LEPs to these conversations going forward, and functional economic areas being something we think is where you can drive the best kind of value for money, have the biggest impact, and get that kind of business and civic leadership as part of those kind of tiers. In London, I think it's slightly different because of the complexity of London, its size and scale, and so we probably do need to think a bit more kind of sophisticatedly about how you deliver across the capital city, both at a kind of pan-London level, but also at tiers below that. And certainly having worked in London at a kind of sub-regional level, I think there is quite a strong case for thinking about sub-regional kind of interventions in this context. Although, I would argue that some of this is the type of thinking that London needs to do for us. And sort of picking up on your point, I think this is bigger than just boroughs, and it's important that kind of borough leaders come together to kind of think of the best and the most appropriate kind of tier to kind of have these discussions. in that context. So I think I'd probably leave it at that, I would say.
Okay, thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, just one final thing about the timing and the consultation. It seems like you're waiting for word from above. Meanwhile, are you talking to people like Despina and Lisa, the people who are dependent on these funds? And actually, they seem quite anxious about what might be happening. And with the timing of the consultation even very vague in what you were saying earlier, it seems like reassurance for those people is going to be a long time coming. Are you talking to them in the meantime? And is there anything more you can say about timing of when we might have this sorted out?
So we have had, people are having conversations. Well, I'm not having kind of direct conversations with people, but people in the team that are looking at these kind of challenges are thinking about it and are having kind of conversations, and will be approaching sort of LEPs and other kind of bodies to kind of facilitate conversations and direct contact. In terms of the kind of in terms of the, we recognise that there will be some challenges associated with this, as there were challenges associated with the transition from the kind of previous programme, European programmes, into a new programme as well. So there's always kind of transitional kind of angst, I would say. So we're conscious of that, and the kind of commitments that the government have made are that, A, we will kind of underwrite kind of future funds as part of when we go forward from day one, so there will be no kind of, the transition will be clear, the new fund will be ready once the kind of old fund has stopped. We need to make a decision on how that at what point we exit that kind of past fund. So is it at the point of exit or isn't it? And ministers will make those decisions in the coming months. So I expect there to be kind of more kind of guidance and support for places once ministers have made those decisions, but we are not currently at a stage where I can tell you today this is the time the consultation is going to go live, and this is the kind of scope of it, because I just can't do that.
Okay, we'll hang on then.
Okay, let's move on to Caroline, the final set from
I
questions.
wanted to, trying to look at opportunities here, which is quite hard for some of us, but we're trying to think about opportunities. If the government is simply, as we're hearing, going to replace the European funds with a like-for-like fund, does it matter that we're losing effectively those European funds? And what opportunity does it give to target the expenditure more, perhaps for London's priorities, or nationally looking at other city and other areas' priorities? That's for all of you. Any of you like to take that?
Shall I kick off?
Alex, why don't you kick off? Yeah.
I think on the role of ERDF and ESF, these ESIF funds, does it matter? I don't think it does. I think if the government took a decision tomorrow that said, actually, your funding isn't going to be European anymore, it's going to be domestic, and it's going to be much less bureaucratic, and you can spend it on what you like, we'd all be quite happy. And I was thinking back to when I started in the civil service, working on some of the things that Lord Heseltine pioneered around the city challenge, a single regeneration budget and so on, and those bigger, flexible, sort of pots were always a welcome thing. So I think that's sort of one issue. I should maybe just draw the kind of committee's attention to kind of two other sort of pots of funds that sort of maybe are at risk, sort of regardless of that. One is so-called transnational funding. So one that's had a lot of publicity, and the Mayor's been talking about, is Horizon 2020. These are these funds where you get together with people from other member states and do kind of innovative research and those kinds of things. No surprises that London benefits huge. London's universities and research institutions benefit hugely from these funds. Government's recognised recently that there probably would be some merit to continue to contribute to those programmes post-Brexit, like the likes of Norway and Switzerland do. And I think that's something we want to strongly encourage, and say there maybe find there's a few other transnational streams like Erasmus, the student exchange profile, culture, one for creative programmes, that we would also want to continue to participate in. So I think that's a point that we would endorse. And the third, it gets a mention, I think, in some of the material you've seen, is around the loans, funding we receive from like, the European Investment Bank, the European Commission's bank. Now, again, the sort of point there is, obviously, you can borrow money from all kinds of people, and the EIB, again, lends to countries that are outside the EU. The Mayor has written very recently to government to just ensure that we get the match funding we're expecting from the European Investment Bank for some of our forthcoming funds to help small businesses and energy efficiency. We think that should be okay, but, London's benefited to the tune of several £billion loans from the EIB for things like Crossrail, big infrastructure schemes, and it's important that some kind of sources of funding are available. And again, it's not quite clear where government's going with things like its the Green Investment Bank, which I think was recently sold to Macquarie's. You know, I think some assurance that this kind of funding, either through the EIB themselves or parallel UK institutions, is going to be important for London, given the scale of transport infrastructure developments here.
If I just pick that up with you, Alex, because I've always been quite obsessed by the EIB and this whole debate, and the EIB chief has basically said that Britain will have to leave EIB after Brexit, even though the Treasury wants to stay, and that we won't, even if we do still find a way to have access to their funds, it's not going to be in such preferential rates that we get now. So
that may well be the case. And I mean, and there's a whole, you know, again, one of the gnarly issue around you know, the UK's stake in the EIB and how that's kind of unwound. I mean, that's one for the sort of wonks. I think our immediate concern is we've got some deals in the pipeline with the EIB now. Our working relations with the EIB colleagues are very good, and we just want to make sure that we're not tripped up by some, you know, failure of process as Brexit approaches.
But your plea from your point of view is that it doesn't matter if the funding is there, it doesn't matter, it's not European, but you want, as the LEAP has proposed, a much simplified model, one that ensures rigorous management but without some of the restrictions to allow innovation.
That's what we've been saying. I mean, and you know, building some of the points that Lord Hazeltine and Chris were making earlier, you know, maybe worth highlighting. I think Sian asked a question about, you know, how the London LEP is perceived. I think one point I would make is as Lord Hazeltine was saying, in some LEP area, you know, well, one thing to remember is that London is both a region and a LEP area, and that's quite unusual. It used to be we were a smaller region, now we're by far the largest LEP. And so, you know, some of our neighbouring LEPs, like sort of Hertfordshire or whatever, you know, are very small, and they are, you know, and they don't need a high level of resource. I think we're lucky that here in City Hall, the LEP, you know, we have a kind of dedicated secretariat. You know, you will find all the papers online. Everything is very transparent and open. Perhaps by comparison, you know, what I'm told by government colleagues is that by comparison with other LEP areas, you know, things are sort of done to a pretty high standard. And I think that's something that we should be using as leverage in our discussions with government about, one, you know, we think devolution is a good thing anyway, and two, you know, the LEP in London is an effective means of doing that.
Who else would like to come in? Spina?
Yeah, I think thinking about opportunities, I think it's always been something that we should have invested in for SMEs, and that's capacity building them to be able to tender so that they gain their accreditations and the knowledge about how to get onto the procurement list so that they can tender for public sector contracts, but they want to get onto private sector supply chains as well. There's still not enough SMEs accessing that kind of work, and that's really, really important for them because it's longer term work, and it also means that they can employ local people and sustain their jobs. And I think as well the added side to this is with the change with Brexit, there might be changing the rules around procurement anyway as well. So it's making sure that businesses are on the front foot about this, understanding are there any opportunities, and should we actually start talking to them about how they can start preparing for that. So I think this is all part of the ongoing communication really about what's happening with the discussions. I think alongside that as well is helping businesses with e-business. So it's about modernisation, making them aware of all the business tools that are out there that they may not be using. A lot of them are connected to cloud, so it's cloud accounting, data storage. It's also e-commerce, and again that's connected to Brexit because if you do use e-commerce, what happens once we do go through Brexit? And there will be changes, so people need to be aware of that, because if we're encouraging them to do that, they're going to have to deal with some challenges further down the route. There is export as well, so again, what are the export opportunities for our SMEs? And I think the last one is something that really is an issue now that I'm aware of. SMEs are not really aware of how they can actually utilise the apprenticeship levy. I know they're not paying it, but they are able to get 10%, I don't know, is it 10% they have to pay towards their apprenticeships training, and they can upskill staff. But so few of them are taking advantage of that. And again, as we go forward and we may have less choice in selection of people coming into the country, it's another area we should start making SMEs aware that there is this resource there and there are these people around, not necessarily even young people now, that they could be starting to consider taking on and developing.
Very helpful, thank you. Lisa?
And I think a lot of the points that has been made applies to the voluntary community and social enterprise sector. we desperately need investment in our infrastructure for capacity building, for the same kind of thing as entering into the contracting market and upskilling around technology particularly, but also just infrastructure to make sure our charities are healthy and are sustainable so that we can support our communities. And opportunities, I was very much struck by what Lord Heseltine's been talking about asking communities what they want the funding to be spent on. I think that's absolutely critical, that having that engagement with our communities, not just throwing money what we think they should be doing, but engaging with communities properly to find out what they need.
Probably ought to feed into Chris the work you're
so
doing.
I think the main point for me, I guess, would be that this is a fresh opportunity to kind of really think about our priorities and like what do we want to kind of do with the money that kind of will be returned and the new money that will be created as a result. So I think it is for us to kind of think about what really works and for places to come up with the best possible kind of answers for that. I mean, this is probably a once in a lifetime opportunity to do that, and so we should kind of maximise it and utilise some of the great thinking that's gone on across the country over the past kind of few years to implement that going forward. And so the great things that are happening in London, we build on those that do work and we stop doing those things that don't.
Okay. Did you have anything to add on that, Lord Heseltine?
Well, I start from a rather different position. You see, I think that Whitehall should be the quality control of the country's performance. It should do the minimum and exert the maximum influence. It should be obsessed by excellence. It should be totally committed to Britain's competitiveness on a world stage in all the fields in which it has a direct responsibility. And it should devolve virtually everything else. Now, this is so countercultural to the way we start, and the whole debate that I've just listened to is a fascinating example about it. What you're asking questions about is the new fund. Why do we need a new fund? Why do we need a fund at all? Why can't we just get, in your case, you into a position where you make these decisions? You don't have funds. You have resources on a wide scale, and you have to satisfy the government that you are, let's take the first and obvious example, pursuing a policy of excellence in every school. You've got the money. They are going to hammer you if you don't deliver excellence. Now, actually, the truth is London's done rather well in improving its educational standards, which is very interesting for all sorts of reasons, as it proves that there are no reasons against raising standards. You have some of the most deprived communities, the most racially mixed communities, all this, and the standards have been jacked up very excitingly. I could take you to parts of the country where the reverse is the case. They will say they haven't got a fund, they haven't got the money, it's all someone else's fault. It's not. Simply they haven't got the right people exerting the right pressure, and that's partially the fault of DFE. We were talking about skills, and I heard very much what Chris was saying. Why does DFE need a $4 billion fund for skills? I mean, who is in DFE who really knows about what in Manchester or Bethnal Green their skills requirement is? And if you think of the process where they'll find out, they'll do a huge survey, and they'll come up with 1 million different solutions, because there are no simple, generalized solutions, but they've got to put them all into a package. And they will therefore generalize and synthesize till they get a common approach. The fund will be about the common approach, but actually the common approach, when you get to Bootle, doesn't mean anything. So why not actually start by becoming quality obsessed, and the execution right out there where the people who actually eat, breathe, dream, sleep are. So that changes the whole thrust of what you've been talking about. But that's what you should be talking about, in my view.
No.
But in fairness, I have to then qualify that. There isn't really a great appetite in local government to do this, because local government, in my humble experience, has resisted every serious reform since the Redcliffe Board row broke out in 1969. I was in Cambridge the other day. Excellence on a world scale. But you should see the local administrative...
But the issue, surely there is, that I absolutely understand what you're saying, but there's no appetite nationally to devolve anything. I mean, Treasury, to get anything out. You know, we've been calling for fiscal devolution for some time to London and various other quite modest measures, and you know, it's impossible to get any buy-in up there. And when we do, we take 2 steps forward. We think we've got transport devolution, we're going to get the metro rail services, we think we're going to get the skills funding.
Well, I've heard what you
and
said
then we go
about
back.
skills.
You know, change of Secretary of State's, change of mind, we go back. So it's both national as well as perhaps local.
But you see, you're talking about my preoccupation with the deference culture, that people accept it. I believe we need a peasant's revolt. I think the local people across the country, amongst the most talented, the most energetic, the biggest wealth creators, simply doff their forelocks to Whitehall. And they shouldn't, but they do. And their MPs let them. Because the career, you see, because it's not rocket science.
Yeah.
The MP's career structure is up the Whitehall parliamentary channel. So trying to push power back out is not what they're about. You know? It's all human nature. But that doesn't stop you being difficult.
Absolutely. Chris, you want to
Yeah,
come
if
in?
I just one point, I guess. I was also in Cambridge yesterday seeing some of that, but I won't express my personal view on that matter. However, I think there is probably something I would say, which is sort of going off my sort of brief and having worked in London government a bit and having worked around on devolution for probably sort of 12 years or so. I think there is partly there's a kind of gap between the types of things that people are asking for and the quality in which they kind of present their arguments that kind of isn't met and therefore doesn't convince people of the kind of its merits. And I think that's something that kind of people in London should definitely kind of think about. It's not just good enough to say we should do a thing like this, but we also need to think about, well, how would we implement that? How is it going to work in practice? And to give people that confidence. You know, I would probably, to a certain extent, agree with you on fiscal devolution, but would also argue that there has been quite a lot of devolution to London over the past kind of decade or so, if not longer. And there have been some kind of serious changes. You know, the establishment, you know, sitting here today is quite a big change. And there is a vehicle to kind of deliver some of this. But it's really important that the kind of message that you send is kind of clear, articulate and kind of sophisticated, because my sense is, and having met with lots of officials from lots of different parts of the country, often that's the gap that is never met. And if you can't convince, you know, not just me but ministers and people in the Treasury, then you're not going to get those things. But I do agree that there is a step change that's required, and you know, given that I work on cities and local growth and have played a major part in delivering some of the devolution ambitions of, you know, secretaries of state, you know, it is something that there are people in Whitehall that do believe in this. But sometimes we just don't get the right presentation back, which makes it more difficult for us.
That's helpful. Alex, I saw you waving over. Did you want to come in on this?
I think it's a reflection of what you're saying, that both the previous mayor and the current mayor have promoted kind of sort of fiscal devolution measures, which would in some case, you know, of course, you know, we wouldn't need to be having the conversation around, you know, government must replace the EU funding with devolved funding if we had some level of flexibility. And of course, as you all know, the UK does operate one of the most centralised and relatively inflexible government sort of local government finance systems in the world. So you know, I mean, I take Chris's point, but I also just think, but it's so hot, you know, when you just compare ourselves with other countries, the UK is way off, and it does require, you know, I, like Chris, have worked on all sides, including in the regional offices that Lord Heseltine mentioned, and I've negotiated on both sides, and I know how maddeningly slow and impossible it is to get even the most modest measures, no matter how great your argument, because that starting point is so high. That's just something.
Then my final question that leads on from it is, what should the Mayor and the Assembly do to really, given where we are, either promote the case for replacement funding for London, or actually make the case for the idea of fiscal devolution so we can stand on our own feet? But in the meantime, if that's going to be too big for us, how do we counter this idea that London does not need support? Because there are, as we said, there are pockets of London that are doing very well, but as we know, there are huge pockets of deprivation, some of the most deprived parts of the country. How do we make the case? Because Whitehall and Westminster, across all the political parties, have an anti-London feeling, and it grows and grows and grows. How do we counter that?
I think, yeah, I think this got this. One, funny enough, some of this came up when we were talking to the Mayor last week at the London Enterprise panel, and precisely that point that you made, and part of this was, there's one bit which is obviously exactly on the same side when it comes to talking to people from sort of other bits, but we certainly have a shared view that EU funding needs to be replaced, and that's something that we can all work together on. Just the point that Shah made around this sort of index of multiple deprivation. I mean, again, the draft paper that's going to government shortly, you won't be surprised to hear, leans heavily on the fact that GVA is not a realistic measure of need. IMD is much more reasonable. But another basic fact people often forget, London's employment rate is below the UK average. That's why London receives so much employment and skills funding in the first place from the EU, and that needs kind of reminding all the way up the line. So there are large amounts of people in London not in education, employment or training. That's a message we have to hammer home, along with the sort of indices of deprivation. And I think that is understood in Whitehall. It's just very important, as Chris is saying, that we make that case loudly.
But you see, it's the same problem. They should devolve the unemployment budget. There's no experimentation, there's very little experimentation in how to get people back into work. This is a very acute problem. I don't need to tell anyone